Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and I'm with the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and today's webinar is how DV and SA advocates can work with landlords for survivors of housing stability. I'll be helping to moderate today's webinar, so if you have questions that come up along the way, we encourage you to put them in the chat box. We'll be answering questions in a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So if you don't have your question answered right away, know that we will try to get to it at the end of the webinar. We'll also make sure that you have all the presenter contact information so that you can follow up with presenters directly, and there will be an opportunity in the evaluation to request continued technical assistance. And just make sure that all of your questions and needs get met today. We're going to also hold what we call a deep dive session on this topic in May. So that's going to happen on May 15th, and you'll see the registration link sent out with your follow-up materials. In the evaluation, you'll also be able to request a certificate of attendance. So if that helps with you, your professional development, you can definitely request that. You should receive it within a week. And make sure that you're using the chat box. Everybody's line is going to be on mute. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our first presenter, Peg from the National Alliance for Safe Housing.
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, everybody. My name is Peg Hacskaylo, and I'm from the National Alliance for Safe Housing. And we are really excited to present this topic with you all today on how domestic violence and sexual assault advocates can work with landlords for survivors' housing stability. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to touch on three primary issues. The first is what the unique housing barriers are for survivors who are seeking access to housing. And then we're going to look at a couple of model programs, both with Safe Horizon and with Dash, about how domestic violence and sexual assault programs can work with landlords to expand housing options. And then we'll round it out with challenges and lessons learned from the work that we've done in our programs. So let me tell you a little bit about Nash, and then my co-presenters will talk to you a little bit about Safe Horizon. So Nash is a subsidiary of the District Alliance for Safe Housing, or DASH, in Washington, D.C. And that's relevant because DASH is the program that we'll be pulling information from later on in this presentation. Nash was launched in October of 2015 as a training and TA provider. We partner with a number of different organizations around the country, including the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Casa de Esperanza, and the National Housing Law Project. And we're part of the Federal Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, which is a partnership among several federal agencies and other national level training and TA providers to address the intersection of domestic violence and housing and homelessness. So Nash's mission is to ensure that survivors of domestic and sexual violence have a full range of survivor-defined safe housing options, and we do that through improved access, increased resources, and innovative solutions, ultimately catalyzing a safe housing movement. So we're really working to spread the message of safe housing across the country. And our vision is ultimately to create a world centering racial equity where safe housing is a right shared by everyone. And now you'll hear about Safe Horizon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olga, and I'm an Associate VP at Safe Horizon. I'm going to talk a little bit about a brief overview of Safe Horizon programs, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and she's going to talk about client-centered practice and services in trauma-informed care. Safe Horizon is the nation's leading victims assistance organization. Our mission is to provide support, prevent violence, and promote justice for victims of crime, abuse, their families, and communities. Just a little overview of Safe Horizon's programs. We run the New York City hotline. We provide services in our community offices, same services as our shelters do, but non-residential. We have an anti-trafficking program, child advocacy centers, which are co-located multidisciplinary teams, which investigate cases of child abuse. We have court programs, counseling centers. We actually have 2 satellites of that counseling center in 2 of our shelters, soon to be a 3rd in our Staten Island shelter. We provide legal support for both family and immigration services. We have street work, which works with homeless youth. About 3 years ago, we started a crime victims assistance program where we have advocates in all the precincts in New York City. And our latest program is the Safe Way Forward, which is preventive and case planning services for survivors and the person who has caused harm. And of course, we have shelters. We have 8 shelters. So we do have shelters which provide a healing environment for families and individuals who are experiencing imminent domestic violence or the threat of violence or abuse and need a safe, confidential place to live. Referrals for our emergency sites are mainly done through the New York City hotline run by Safe Pryzen, although we do receive referrals from the DV unit and the New York City Department of Homeless Services. Sometimes we also get referrals from Child Protective Services, the DA's office, the Family Justice Centers, and perhaps other partners in the community. As I stated before, we do have 8 shelters. 6 of them are emergency shelters. And we have 2 who are transitional shelters, and we have shelters in all 5 boroughs. Our shelters really vary. We have our smallest shelters, which is 9 units, 20 beds, to our largest, which is 53 units and 180 beds. We are licensed for a total of 710 beds, and we are currently building a 3rd transitional shelter, which I'm very excited about, and that one will have 44 units and 112 beds. On any given night, we are providing a safe space for up to 275 families. Each of our shelters are unique in their layout and configuration. We have spaces where clients share a communal kitchen and bathrooms. We have spaces where folks share a unit, and then we have facilities where everyone has a private unit. In our spaces, we offer case management services, support groups, legal consultation, child care services as needed for appointments. We provide activities for adults and children. We also provide vocational and housing assistance, economic empowerment, and just regular support counseling for our clients. Eligibility is set by the state. Clients can be in emergency shelter for 90 days with possible extensions that can a total up to 180 days in shelter. For our transitional shelters, referrals come from the Human Resources Administration, which is one of the agencies that oversee us. And they basically link families to the unit depending on the safe borough, the configuration of the family. So in order for clients to be eligible to go to a transitional shelter, they have to be in emergency for at least 90 days. Families in the Tier 2 or transitional shelter can be in our space for up to a year, but sometimes, depending on the needs of the family, they can be there for a little bit longer. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. So as Olga gave us sort of an overview of sort of our services at Safe Pryzen, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our philosophy and how we really approach practice at Safe Pryzen overall, and that also means at all 8 of our shelters. So Safe Pryzen uses a model called client-centered practice, where we are really seeing each individual as a unique circumstance that everyone can make decisions based on what their goals are and their needs are. So it's not a one-size-fits-all service model. It's really taking into account what the individual is looking for in their life and focusing on a balance of both concrete and emotional goals. So we don't want to just focus on providing concrete services to our clients. We want to look at how we can create a space where clients can also explore their emotional needs as well. And all of our services are trauma-informed, and that even includes our housing services, which we're going to be talking about a little bit more, because we need to understand that all of our clients are trauma survivors in some way. They may not all have symptoms of trauma, but as they're going out and navigating the housing market, their experiences of domestic violence and trauma are coming with them. And so we have really made sure that our services match that framework, that we understand that trauma symptoms may come up when clients are looking for housing. We may understand that their past experiences of abuse may also come up. So we'll be talking more later in the presentation about how our services have really adapted so that our clients can be successful in what is, particularly in New York City, is an extremely tight housing market. So we'll turn it back over to Peg. Oh, sorry, nope, that's me. My apologies, everyone. So continuing on, we want to focus on what are some barriers to accessing affordable housing. So we know there are people participating in this webinar from all over the country, and there will be differences in the housing markets where you are. So some of the things we will be talking about may or may not be your exact experiences, but we just want to speak to what we've seen as general barriers. So we know that housing providers may discriminate based on race, ethnicity, national identity, origin, and the subsidy amounts that our clients are experiencing may be under what the housing market is. And so, we are having the challenge of having to convince landlords and brokers to take our clients with different subsidy amounts. We also know that credit can be a big barrier, and we'll talk more about that as well, but that there are a lot of barriers for an already tight housing market, and landlords basically have their pick of everyone, right, that they can choose from any different person that they may be looking for in terms of housing, and they don't have to choose our clients. So those are some of the barriers that we're dealing with. So continuing on, there are some survivor-specific barriers to accessing housing that we want to focus on. So housing providers may discriminate based on their first impression. So if you show up and you are with your kids, or you present in an anxious manner, or if you open up about being a domestic violence survivor, landlords and brokers may have certain impressions of you. If you're bringing 3 or 4 children with you, they may make determinations on who they want to live in their spaces. If the survivor discloses that they have experienced domestic violence, the landlord may say, oh, this is too much trouble, this is a problem tenant, I'd rather pick someone else. And so there's a lot of ways that our clients going out into the real estate market can be less desirable as a tenant than some other people. And particularly when you're going for an apartment and there are hundreds of people trying to get that same apartment, we deal with a lot of these same barriers. Another thing that we have identified as a barrier is that a lot of times our clients don't have references to use when they're looking for an apartment. So domestic violence survivors may be isolated from friends and family members due to the domestic violence. They may not have people that they want to know where they're applying for in terms of housing. So, if they put in a housing application with a certain management company and they need a reference, that could identify the abusive person or other people in their life where they're looking to live, which could lead to a lack of safety. So that's something that we often don't think about, especially for families living in shelter. We also know that families, depending on how many kids someone has, depending on the age of the kids, landlords may have a reaction towards that. And, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily legal to have that reaction, but we know that, again, when the market is really crowded with a lot of people looking at the same apartments, people may say, oh, you have young children or teenagers, it's going to be too loud, too quiet, something, and they may not be as interested in working with that family.
So I'm going to be talking a little bit about survivor-specific barriers to accessing affordable housing. And I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this, but often our clients have either very poor credit or delinquent credit stemming from outstanding debt, such as student loans, maxed out credit cards, perhaps outstanding utility bills. There may have been economic abuse by the abuser, such as using the client's Social Security cards or Social Security number to open accounts and maxing out those accounts as well. We also see clients with no credit history. Two of our biggest hurdles for our clients are past evictions and also criminal histories. We've had numerous times where clients with these issues have had a really, really challenging time connecting, or maybe they were interested in an apartment, the landlord or broker did a background check and these issues came up and they had a difficult time to continue working with the client. And so one of the things that I just want to emphasize is the importance of really taking this on as a team. And so if somebody's stuck, if someone doesn't know where to go next, I think it's really important to discuss particular cases as a team, engage the client, see in what ways you can work with the client around, past evictions, perhaps, going through the client's credit history to see where you can work with the client on paying back, certain debt that they're able to pay back, or at least engaging the credit unions and see if there's anything that can be taken out of the client's credit history. We've had occasions where a client, had a criminal background and applied to New York City housing, and which was a huge barrier for the client, but the case manager worked with the client, advocated for the client, provided advocacy letters, engaged other partners that were working with this client in the community, and they were actually able to advocate for the client to be able to apply and get on the waiting list for New York City housing. And so there may be barriers, but again, with the effort of the team, thinking outside of the box and engaging community members, that is, those are some of the ways that you can support the client.
So also, as I mentioned, services at, say, Pryzen, and I know also at Dash are really looking from a trauma-informed lens, and we really want to highlight for a moment how trauma impacts housing. And I think this is really important to pay attention to because I think we make assumptions with our clients that they're going to be very excited to get housing and do everything they can and do all the right things. And what we see is that sometimes the trauma comes up and impacts the person's ability to get housing. So one of the first ways that we see this a lot is hyperarousal around the process and available options. So what hyperarousal will look like is an increased anxiety, maybe an impatience, constant worry. And what you'll see from your clients is they may be coming to your office once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day. We know in the shelters we regularly work where our clients live, and so they have great access to you, and so you may find them asking you for updates every single day when the housing process doesn't move that quickly. The other way we've seen it is that we've had clients who call landlords all the time, or brokers, or they call for updates around their housing to the point where we've had some people say, I don't want to work with this person anymore because they keep bugging me, they keep calling me too much. And that's really the hyperarousal from the trauma, that someone is really worried about this coming through and whether or not they're going to be able to take this next step in their life, and it comes out in this, this process. Another thing that comes up is, for those of you who are in shelters, we know that a lot of times clients report that they don't want to be in shelter, that there's rules and regulations that they would prefer to live without. But then when it comes closer to actually leaving the shelter, people come to terms with what it might be to be out on their own, that they may not be in a place that it has 24-hour security, if that's the kind of setup. They may not be in a place with an alarm system, with cameras. They may not have someone to call or reach out to in the middle of the night, whereas in the shelter, there's always other people around, or there's always emergency staff you can reach. So that's one of the things that clients start to realize as they leave shelter, oh my goodness, I'm not going to have these supports. And that actually can feel very unsettling for our clients. And what we see lastly is that there's an increase of anxiety as the idea of moving out of the shelter nears. And so that they might report increased trauma symptoms, increased symptoms of depression or anxiety as they get closer and closer to their move-out day, because they are very overwhelmed by the thought of leaving this space where they've had these really comprehensive supportive services throughout. So it's just an important thing to remember that we may think of housing as this very exciting stage in our clients' lives, and it is, but also it can cause a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety.
Right. Rachel, thank you. Those were all really astute points, and this is Peg. I just wanted to add some of the things that we have learned in working with survivors at Dash and the way in which domestic violence and sexual assault can impact that landlord-survivor relationship are things like stigma and shame, that a lot of survivors are embarrassed about their history of having been victimized. They may be experiencing a lot of shame, as well as what Rachel touched on, some of the trauma that can really impede their readiness to move on to living alone in housing. And so it's really important for us as providers to keep that in mind. They may feel obligated to disclose personal information about the abuse that they've experienced to landlords, and that's where it's so important as a service provider to be able to help broker that relationship with landlords so that we can ensure that survivors don't disclose more information than they need to with landlords, because we're not trying to create a situation where there's oversharing or a lack of safety for survivors living in their properties. They may fear discrimination on the flip side as a result of their victimization, and may feel that they won't be eligible for housing. And they also might just not be aware of what their rights and protections are in housing, and we're going to touch on that in a little while. So there are a lot of very real barriers that survivors face to accessing and getting into affordable housing. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how programs can work with landlords to expand housing options for survivors, and why. and you all may have some experience with this, but what we have found through Safe Horizon and through Dash is that working with landlords can really help survivors, support survivors' choice to access and keep safe, permanent housing. So being able to broker that relationship between a landlord and the survivor who's going to be their tenant can really help facilitate a smooth transition into permanent affordable housing. It really helps to increase survivors' choice to safely remain in their communities if they're able to do that safely, and help stay connected to their social and family networks. It also can really go a long way towards successfully implementing rapid rehousing programs, which we know has been the trend in providing permanent and affordable housing to survivors and to families facing homelessness, as well as for many scattered site transitional housing models that are relying on relationships with landlords to provide housing for survivors. And finally, it just helps to break down myths that landlords may have that continue to create unnecessary and even sometimes unlawful barriers to survivors and their families being able to get into safe, permanent housing. So there are a lot of good reasons for why programs should be involved in this process. And now we're going to spotlight Safe Horizons project.
Thank you, Peg. So we recognize that our housing specialists did not have the capacity to spend a lot of time out in the field looking for apartments, developing relationships with local landlords and brokers. Much of their time and attention was focused on program services. So due to this need, we actually developed a new position, which is the Coordinator of Housing Services. So with this particular position, the person has expertise in both the housing market and actually has experience working in the human services field. So he's a bit of a unicorn. We were, lucky to find Carlos. Here in New York City, most landlords use brokers or realtors in order to, provide that service and be able to get clients connected to the landlord. And so one of the things that we needed was to, really understand the market and the nuance of the realtor-broker relationships to the landlord and the kind of control they have over referrals to the landlord. One of our goals was to have a full understanding of what motivated brokers and why they were reluctant to accept vouchers. So some of the things that what we learned is that here in New York City, a lot of the brokers or landlords were burned by the last subsidy rolled out a few years prior to the latest subsidy, which was about 3 years ago here in New York City. And so we really had to sell this new subsidy. And so it was important that we match clients to the apartment, that our staff had excellent follow-up and communication with the broker or the realtor, making sure that we got clients to appointments, that they were prepared in order to attend the appointment, and that happened very quickly because, as you all know, it's a really competitive market. And if a client was, scheduled to view an apartment, we needed to make sure that we got them there as quickly as possible and prepared. One of the things that, we found is that there's a lot of red tape, as all of you know, working with other agencies. And so making sure that our staff, when they were prepared to hand in the packet for that voucher, that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, and that we did our best to make sure that we provided a packet that was ready to go, and so that it could be processed as quickly as possible, because landlords are not going to wait weeks and months for a packet to be processed. And so expediting the leasing appointment was really important. But most of all, having a financial incentive for landlords and brokers really mattered. The subsidies that we currently have access to, or the clients do in New York City, give clients or brokers 4 months worth of rent upfront. And so, many of our clients have to contend with other folks in the community that have subsidies, particularly with the New York City homeless population. They have, their own subsidies, and sometimes those subsidies, are a little bit more attractive to landlords because they actually provide a year up front. And so we have to learn to train our staff on the complexities of the system. And one way we are doing that is by having monthly meetings with our housing specialists. Sometimes case managers attend those meetings as well if there isn't a housing specialist at the site. And so during that meeting, which also includes the housing coordinator, we talk about initiatives, challenges, experiences. We exchange a lot of information and ideas on what the staff have done to, to help our clients and support our clients during their housing process. And this meeting really has helped our staff be a little bit more knowledgeable and a little bit more savvy about the housing market and what strategies have worked for folks. If the organization that you work for isn't able to create a position in order to support clients in the way that we have, perhaps one of the things that can think about is how to engage local brokers, realtors. Perhaps someone will be willing to come and do a training with the staff, talk about the market, what are the trends, whether or not landlords or brokers are interested in vouchers, what are some of the concerns that you're hearing, and kind of strategize in ways that you can present it, present our clients, present the need that they have. Perhaps you can provide a space for the landlords or brokers to express any concerns, maybe dispel some myths, because what we found is there was a lot of myths out there about the programs that clients had available at the time. There were just a lot of misinformation out there in the community, and I think that getting landlords and brokers together really assisted in them understanding what the vouchers were, what does it mean, what were some of the incentives, why would they want to work with domestic violence survivors. So I think that was really helpful. And so, you can go ahead and host informational sessions for local partners. Perhaps there's a board member or someone in the staff that has realty experience and can kind of share that information with you all. And lastly, is one of the things that you can do is also engage local colleges to see if you can get interns to come in and help out with housing searches. Maybe that intern can go out and engage local realtors and brokers to see if they have any apartments available, get a sense of whether or not they're interested in working with clients with subsidies. They can escort clients to appointments. They can prep the client before they go to the appointment. And of course, they can assist with any paperwork that you may have. And having an intern come in and doing that work and kind of take that responsibility from the housing specialist or the case manager, and they can focus a little bit more in assisting the client and figuring out how to overcome those challenges that the client may have to getting connected with housing.
So I think picking up on that, one of the things that we really learned at Safe Pryzen is we had to understand housing rather than getting the housing market to understand us. So that's why we really looked for identifying people who had expertise in real estate, in broker and landlord relationships, because we can't necessarily expect the housing market to totally adapt to us. We sort of had to adapt to the housing market. So we also did a lot of work to help prepare our clients. We realized that, talking to a landlord is like a job interview. And so one of the things we did is we developed scripts so that our clients had the words to say to landlords, so they were prepared, so when they were feeling anxious, when they weren't sure what to say, they'd have a script that, when they picked up the phone and called, they could go through that and it would really outline everything so they weren't trying to come up with things on the spot. We did role plays and we continue to do role plays with our staff members and our shelter residents so that they can practice, because we know it can be really intimidating to talk to people. In New York City, we have landlords and brokers getting hundreds of calls a day for apartments, and so how can you stand out? How can you practice so you sound really confident and you sound like the kind of person a landlord wants to rent to? We also wanted, as Olga mentioned, so when our clients in New York are renting an apartment using one of the city subsidies, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of forms, and so we wanted to make sure that everyone was really familiar with that so we could submit packets in a timely manner and they would be able to get approved. So we, again, with the role plays, we prepared people for how to pitch themselves to a broker, how to talk to people, how to handle difficult questions that may come up, whether it's related to eviction, bankruptcy, credit. So we really help our clients focus on who they're coming to the table as now as a client. So maybe there were issues in the past, maybe there were credit issues, or there might have been bankruptcy, but where are they now, and how can they sell themselves to a landlord or a broker as who they are today? And I think helping them look to move forward rather than focusing too much on what happened in the past, because especially in cases of domestic violence, we know that when there's economic abuse, sometimes some of the debt issues or credit issues may not be a result of what our clients have done, but we still do a lot of work to link them to credit repair agencies so they can begin that process. So we also, as I mentioned, we want to help our clients stand out from prospective tenants. So, that means that you dress like you're going on an interview. We'll help clients, get clothing if they need to be on time, to take steps to arrange childcare in advance so they could get to an apartment viewing, so that they can be prepared for the fact that you're going to go to a lot of apartments and not get them all. That the chances of someone saying yes are not as great as the chances of someone saying no. So we prepare our clients for that so they really understand what is the process. The other thing is that we've had to focus a lot on knowing when to move on. So sometimes you're dealing with a landlord or broker that sells a really good idea of an apartment, and then the client gets to the apartment and there's no stove. There's repairs that need to happen. There's an extra fee, an extra charge, and sometimes our clients are so desperate to get out of the shelter situation that they want to hold on to an apartment that won't pass the city's inspection, or that the landlord's trying to do what we call here a side deal, where they're trying to get additional money that they're not supposed to, our clients are not supposed to agree to when they're using the city subsidies. And so we really want to help people know when someone's trying to maybe get extra money out of them or doing something, not in the right way, and know when to move on from those apartments. And then really staying hopeful that you're going to call dozens and dozens of places, maybe even hundreds, and it might take a while before something will come through, and preparing clients for that is really, really important.
And so we do provide additional on-site programming. So one of the things that we offer is a group called Life After Shelter, which is really to prepare clients for practical things like how to request a repair, how to budget, the emotional transition between coming from shelter, where particularly there are transitional shelters where clients are with us for a really long time, and how to get them prepared for being on their own. Most of our clients are young, young families between the ages of 18 and 30, and for many it's the first time that they're on their own and that they're solely responsible for themselves and their children. And so it's really imperative to create opportunities for clients to share their experiences, to express the things that they're going through, and to problem solve. And so we have both psychoeducational and skill building groups. And in the psychoeducational groups, we do talk to clients about coping with fears and anxiety, both during the process of trying to find housing and once they obtain housing, what that's going to look like once they move out of the facility and no longer have staff available 24 hours a day and their case manager to assist with a particular problem. Or even, practical things like obtaining a Metro card to go to an appointment, or getting food pantry items because perhaps they didn't budget for that week or that month. We do provide other services such as economic empowerment. We have a curriculum for that. We have 6 workshops. So it's a 6-week cycle, and we provide 3 to 4 cycles per year. We do provide these cycles in our tier 2s, which is the longer stay, only because clients, are with us for a longer period of time, and they can actually attend the 6 workshops for the 1 cycle. We needed to modify that a little bit in the emergency shelter because our clients are with us as long as they need the space. And so we wanted to make sure that the workshops were available to clients as they needed. And so, someone can come in the first workshop and then maybe not come in until the 4th or the 5th workshop again. And so in the economic curriculum, we do talk to clients about budgeting, savings. We do a lot of work with clients around their credit, whether or not clients want to bank Many of our clients don't have a checking or savings account, and they may not trust the banking system. And so I think talking to them about the benefits of banking has been really helpful. We do talk to them also about entrepreneurship, if that's something that the client is interested in. We talk about retirement, and then what they want to achieve in the future. And one of those things may be home ownership, and so we talk to them about that as well. We do have monthly housing groups in all of our sites. In that housing group, the clients have the opportunity to hear from our housing specialist staff on the various subsidies. They get consistent and accurate information. This is another area where I think it's really important to provide a platform for clients to hear about, what's going on in the city, what are some of the things that are coming up, such as affordable housing, or in New York City, we actually have lottery systems for housing for clients. And so it's really important to provide a space just to clarify information, because oftentimes what happens is that clients will talk to one another about their experiences or what they've done. It may actually be accurate, and that can actually create a barrier for the client. But I think it's also important for clients to hear, from one another, and so this space actually creates an opportunity for peer support and to build community, and for clients to really support one another in this process, because it can be very taxing. It can be, it can cause a lot of anxiety. Clients can lose hope about whether or not they're going to be able to get out of the shelter system. So these supports help prepare our clients for another disruption in their life. This may be the second or third time within the year that clients have had to move, or at least the prospect of moving. And they need to make decisions on, the location of where they're going to try to find housing, with schools. Perhaps clients were able to get their child into, a particular school, and they want to make sure that they stay within that community. It's also important for clients to think through what kind of resources are in that community and whether or not it's a good fit, right? So our clients, sometimes I think that as providers, we, get into this mode of thinking that, where clients should take the first apartment that's available. But just like we do, clients have choices about where they want to live, right? And so clients need to make a decision on whether or not they want to move to a location where, perhaps there isn't, there aren't any services available immediately. Maybe it's too far from their job or from their child's daycare. Perhaps, I had a client who did not want to move to a location because there were a lot of hills. And you know what? It makes a lot of sense for her since she has 2 small children. And so in the wintertime when it snowed, she was the one that had to, go up that hill with the stroller. And so it's really important to, also acknowledge that clients have, they have a choice in where they want to live. And that we need to work with our clients if that's the case. And I think that the more support you can build into your programming, the more resources that you have available for clients, can only help them in their journey.
So as we've already mentioned a bit, we really felt like staff needed training in the housing market. So that was either, getting people to trainings on what the housing market is really like in New York City. So that's something that you can do in your area. Olga mentioned earlier, bringing in members from your community that work in real estate so you can understand a bit more on what are they looking for in prospective tenants. What are the barriers? What are the financial implications? All those things can be really helpful for your staff to know. The other thing we really started looking at is, how to make the best use of our staff's time, because we know in social service agencies we're all doing a lot of different roles. And if you are a case manager and you're helping someone with housing, and you're helping someone with their emotional well-being, and you're helping them with school issues, you're helping them with food or transportation issues, you have so much on your plate. And if you're calling landlords and brokers all day long, going after one apartment, that may not be the best use of that person's time. So we started to look at, are there multiple people who could be calling? Do we have people who can be looking for apartments while someone's doing some direct service with clients? So we can sort of split that up because it's a lot of work. I'm sure any of you on this webinar who have been looking for apartments in your community can relate to the fact that it can be a lot of work. The other thing that we really wanted to do for staff is really empower them with understanding what is legal and what is illegal or unethical, and having some information. So we had a training for staff that was given by the Human Rights Commission in New York City about what constitutes housing discrimination. And so it will be really helpful, if you haven't already done this, is both training your staff on federal law in this area, and if in your city there are additional protections. New York City has additional layers of protections that are also above and beyond the Fair Housing Act. And so it's important to get that information to your staff so that if they're talking to landlords or brokers, that they know if something sounds right or kind of sounds off. And then the one last thing is we just, again, have to help our clients manage desperation and expectation. So how long it may take, in New York City, all of our apartments that we submit for through using the city voucher system have to be inspected, which means someone's got to schedule an appointment to go in to view the apartment, then a lease signing has to be scheduled. This doesn't happen overnight. So how do you help a client manage that? We work to teach staff grounding skills and coping skills to manage the anxiety that comes up. We, again, want people to know that they don't have to accept an apartment that is substandard, that it doesn't have the required appliances, that doesn't have the repairs done, that there's standards, and that's why the apartments are inspected. We also want clients and staff both to realize how much work goes into finding an apartment. And so it can be a full-time job for our clients. And then you think about particularly families in shelter that have all these additional things that they're worried about. So we've looked at a lot of different things in this area. And the last thing that Olga and I wanted to talk about before we turn it over to Dash is just the fact that there is structural racism and implicit bias that goes into our clients' housing search, and there's a lot of factors that relate to that. And so, we just wanted to touch upon them in some way. So the first one I just wanted to talk about is where housing is available, that the apartments that our clients may be able to afford, particularly due to gentrification, has limited their access to live in certain areas of the city, and a lot of that is often impacted by race. And so we want to really acknowledge that our clients may not have full access to apartments in all areas of our city because of the increase in rent due to communities getting pushed out of neighborhoods that they had always lived in.
And so, as Rachel was talking about before, I think it can be really frustrating for clients to, navigate these really complex systems. Many of our clients, for example, are on public assistance, and so they have to go to the public assistance office and, demonstrate that they're eligible. They also have to pay attention to whether or not their case is sanctioned. Maybe they missed an appointment. And so, these things can really negatively impact their ability to qualify for subsidized housing. Within the first 2 weeks that clients are in emergency shelter, we do have frank discussions with clients about systems. We ask them, like, how knowledgeable are they? Have they interacted with any of these systems before? Particularly with our clients who are our immigrant population, they may never have, dealt with any of these systems, and so they really don't understand it. Or maybe they're just coming from out of state, and they're not, used to New York City and dealing with the systems here, which can be pretty complex, as I said before. And so I think it's really important to, have a conversation with the client, manage expectations, make sure that
as staff, we are as knowledgeable and prepared as we can be to have these conversations with our clients, prepare them, for the eventuality that probably something's going to go wrong, and that they may have to go 2 or 3 times to their local public assistance office to fix something that has gone wrong. And we definitely acknowledge that it can be frustrating and very time-consuming. We listen, actively to what our clients have to say. We validate their feelings to let them know that we're here to support them and guide them as much as possible. And as Rachel mentioned before, we do talk to clients about the legal and illegal ways that they may experience discrimination, as well as how to handle uncomfortable situations when they're having a face-to-face meeting or over the phone meeting with a landlord or broker, or perhaps when they go view an apartment. Sometimes when clients are viewing apartments, the landlord or the broker will ask questions about their personal life, or they'll make comments about, maybe they have children or older children or very young children. And so our clients have experienced discrimination in many ways. Sometimes they experience bias because they're a DV survivor, and people make a lot of assumptions about that. They experience bias related to their age or their race or ethnicity. Certainly income discrimination happens a lot, and so we'll hear from landlords and brokers that they don't accept subsidies, which is actually illegal here in New York City. That, once again, that they make comments about, the client having young children or maybe teenagers or, too many children. There are ways that landlords and brokers discriminate against our clients, but it's not illegal, such as, requesting that clients have a credit score of 700 or above, which I think the national average isn't even close to that. They also expect, folks to have 4 times income of the rent. And also our clients deal with a lot of expensive application fees. We've seen application fees here for $100 just to apply. So those are some of the ways that our clients experience discrimination. And so, as Rachel mentioned before, we have done trainings with our team from various agencies in New York City talking about discrimination laws. We do a lot of advocacy with the landlord. As I think a couple of folks mentioned in the questions, Carlos did develop a script and also a housing manual for our staff. And so the script is both for our staff to talk to brokers and landlords, and also for the client to talk to brokers and landlords. And some of the trainings that we've had with our staff in order to prepare them for being able to work with our clients is around client-centered practice, risking connections, and motivational interviewing. And we've also done a lot of training with our staff around understanding racism and structural racism as well.
So thank you all for listening to our spotlight, and we will turn it over to Dash.
Thanks, Olga and Rachel. That was so comprehensive and thorough that I have a feeling you all will see a lot of what was already discussed in the content that I'll discuss about Dash. So Dash basically has 2 programs where we capitalize on our relationships with landlords. The first is our Empowerment Project, and that is a 2-year transitional to permanent scattered site housing program, so for survivors and their families. So it's really a lot like a rapid rehousing program, except that we provide a 2-year subsidy. And we work with the survivors to lease up the apartments in their own names, and that is thanks to the relationships that we've had with landlords throughout the city to be able to do that. And then we provide a subsidy for their rent, and depending on the survivor's ability, they can supplement the rent as well. And then our other program is our Housing Resource Center, and that is really the hub of Dash's efforts to prevent homelessness for survivors, where Dash provides support in completing housing applications, obtaining safety transfers, navigating the public housing system, and accessing other community services, as well as connecting to affordable housing through our landlord network. And so again, we have really been able to help survivors through our relationships to lease up apartments in their own names or just maintain their housing safely in the community if they're able to remain safe and stable in their own homes. So a couple of the strategies that Dash uses for maintaining productive landlord relationships are that we keep all lines of communication open while actively working to protect the confidentiality of participants. So we really, as I mentioned before, work to act as a broker between the survivor and the landlord and help facilitate that relationship while not divulging the participants' background or circumstances concerning their victimization. But we encourage participants to be accountable and adhere to all the terms and conditions of their lease, and for many survivors it may be the first time that they've leased up. For others, they may have been on other apartment leases, but we really want them to understand the terms of their lease. And then through advocacy and support during home visits, Dash will assist the participants with establishing a budget so that they can pay the rent on time and that becomes a priority. And that's, again, based on the survivor's ability as to how much they may be paying towards the rent. Sometimes Dash subsidizes the full amount of the rent. Sometimes Dash pays for a portion and the survivor pays for the remaining portion. But the idea here is to work with the survivors to help them learn how to be good tenants and really take their leases and paying on time seriously. And then we also provide training and TA to landlords and their staff on what the local and federal housing protections are for victims. And Rachel and Olga mentioned that there are federal housing protections such as the Fair Housing Act, as well as others that we want to make sure that landlords are aware of and that they're not discriminating against survivors because of their status as victims. So it's really about facilitating that relationship all the way around. And the way that we do that with landlords is to try to support them to incorporate safety for their tenants, all of their tenants, not just the survivors that Dash is referring to them, but all of their tenants in their properties, to really understand the safety of the tenants and incorporate that into every aspect of their property management. And so helping them understand in a comprehensive way how to make sure that their properties are safe as well as their tenants, and educating them on best practices in responding to domestic violence on their property. So being able to reach out to emergency services or to Dash or other community partners when they have tenants who are experiencing domestic violence, and not trying to take that role on themselves as a social worker, but really connecting with the appropriate programs to help intervene. And then offering your program or offering Dash as a referral to landlords or property management, again, so that they have some place to refer tenants who are dealing with domestic violence. And then assisting landlords with making the application process and all other processes survivor-friendly. So that means really approaching survivors in a way that gives them autonomy and gives them choice and allows and helps them understand the lease and allows them to pursue things in the way that works best for the survivor. So we work to educate landlords, as Rachel, I think, mentioned and I mentioned previously, on what those federal and local housing protections are. And we, Nash and our partners, have an entire training available on the local and federal housing protections that you can access at the Safe Housing Partnerships website. We'll have that at the end of the webinar. But we just want to highlight on what some of those protections are. They include things like the Violence Against Women Act, which ensures that any housing provider who receives federal funding, so public housing providers or landlords who accept Section 8 vouchers, that they're obligated to ensure that survivors or their tenants aren't discriminated against because of their history of domestic violence or sexual assault. The Fair Housing Act, which really stipulates that landlords treat all of their tenants fairly across the board and that they not single out any group of tenants based on their status. As well as the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there are a number of federal protections that landlords should really be familiar with. And then, as Rachel and Olga mentioned, there may be local and state laws that are applicable to landlords and property managers in your areas, and it's important that they be familiar with what those protections look like for survivors. That may include things like allowing survivors to break their lease early if they need to get out of a property because of domestic violence, not screening out prospective tenants because of their history of domestic violence, or providing emergency transfers for tenants to other units within their properties if they're not safe to be in the unit that they're in. And so there are a variety of different kinds of protections that, again, Nash can provide more training on to help support you as you're educating landlords around those kinds of protections. And then, likewise, it's very important to provide survivors with education about what their housing rights and responsibilities are. So helping them to understand what the protections are for their survivors, for them, I mean, as they are looking to apply to housing, so that, as I touched on before, they're not necessarily feeling compelled to divulge their history of domestic violence as they're applying for rental housing, because that's not relevant to their eligibility as a prospective tenant, and so they don't have to share that information. And therefore, it provides that much less possibility for there to be discrimination against them. But also working with survivors to help them budget for housing expenses so that they are learning how to make sure to keep up their homes, to reach out to the landlords when there is a problem in their unit, to make sure that those problems get taken care of and that they don't have to pay for, say, appliance repairs or major repairs in their units, and really helping survivors understand what those costs are and how to incorporate those into their budget, and then clarifying what their roles and responsibilities are. So as Dash is providing home-based advocacy to survivors who are living in rental properties, working with them in an ongoing way to help them budget, to help them report problems in their units, and keep up their units and the payments in a timely way, and really support them to be good tenants. It's also so important to provide survivors with choice whenever that's possible. So if you're in the process of helping survivors to access housing through a landlord network, then directing them to a variety of different units where they might be able to apply for housing, and not just pigeonholing them into one neighborhood or one area where you think it might be something that the tenant can afford or something that would be safer for them, but really trying to give survivors as much choice in where they want to live and what's going to be the right fit for them. And to do that, it's so helpful to create a portfolio of housing options so that you have a variety of different places to recommend to survivors when you're helping them to lease up. And thinking about if the survivor can safely stay in their current location with support and advocacy. It's not possible for a lot of survivors who need to go into a confidential shelter or who need to relocate from their neighborhood because of the threat of violence that they've experienced or the ongoing risk of abuse or violence that they may be experiencing. But for some survivors, they can be assisted to remain safely in their current location and with ample safety planning and support to keep their own homes so that they don't relocate. So considering what that might look like for survivors is very important. And can you help provide maybe emergency financial assistance to help them maintain their safe permanent housing? So if the issue is that the survivor is thinking that she needs to relocate because she's about to be evicted as a result of, say, her abuser not paying the rent, and her abuser is now no longer in the area, is it possible to provide financial assistance to pay that back rent and help her keep her own home rather than asking her to relocate or move into a shelter altogether? And that's a strategy that we have found to be incredibly successful at Dash and also really popular with survivors who can stay safely in the community. So providing survivors with options and, again, support to really make safe decisions. So working with survivors to develop a checklist and really help them think through all of the different elements of the units that they may be considering to move into. And that would include, is the rent affordable now? And is it going to be affordable to them after 2 years? So if you're looking at developing landlord relationships for a rapid rehousing program, then helping the survivor think through when your rental subsidy ends and they're going to be responsible for assuming that cost themselves, is it going to be something that will be affordable to them in the long term? And the Economic Security for Survivors project provides tools, and this was something that was developed through Wider Opportunities for Women and is now with the Futures Without Violence organization. But they provide tools for helping to think through those kinds of costs and what their affordability might look like in the long term. So we recommend you go to this link to help work through that. But then also just helping survivors think through, is this housing option safe, and not just safe from the violence that they may have experienced or from a potential threat of abuse, but also, is the unit safe in general? Is there good lighting in the hallways and the surrounding spaces? What is the placement of the mailboxes and the dumpsters? Are they in a place that is well lit or well populated where it's not going to be subject to potential attack or threat? What is the proximity to public transportation? Will survivors be able to get to their schools or get to their jobs from wherever they're considering? And then are there safety elements? So is there a peephole in the door or locks on the windows or cameras around the property? So really encouraging survivors to think thoroughly and broadly around what is a good safety plan for them in the prospective property that they're considering to apply to. And then from your perspective, as Rachel and Olga touched on, ensuring that the properties meet HUD safety guidelines. And there's, as they said, a reason that, that there are inspections. And so as a broker to these properties, we have a relationship or a responsibility to make sure that the units that we're referring our survivors to are going to be safe for them as well. So finally, we're going to move to the challenges and lessons learned. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you. So I think what I want to say, and thank you all for being with us throughout this time. We will get to your questions in just a couple minutes, but we want to acknowledge that this process is difficult, that there's a lot we've learned from it, and that we learn from our clients and our staff's experiences every day, and it's going to continue to be a challenging process because navigating the real estate market isn't easy, and it's a very expensive system, and so we're always going to be learning more about the system, and there's no one answer, but hopefully from the presentation today you've gotten exposure to some different ideas on how to approach your practice.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we've learned is the importance of maintaining confidentiality when advocating for our clients with brokers and landlords. I think that sometimes we're so enthusiastic about our prospective apartment. Perhaps the client, it's been really challenging for them to get connected to a landlord. And we're so eager that we may or may not be providing information that really should be confidential, and clients have a right to privacy. And so I think it's really important just to be mindful that you're not sharing any information other than what is absolutely necessary to connect this client to to a particular apartment that's available. And I think also talking to clients about maintaining their own confidentiality is really important as they interact with landlords and brokers. Like questions may come up, and perhaps the client feels that by sharing their story, they'll get a little bit more interest or perhaps empathy. And so I think it's also really important to talk to clients about strategizing how to respond to questions that may be intrusive or feel very personal to the client, and preparing them for the inevitability of a landlord or broker asking them like a really intrusive personal question, because it does happen and it does come up.
Another thing is being really mindful that clients have a right to live the life that they want to live. And I know that sounds pretty straightforward, but what that means is that our clients may move into apartments and move other people into those apartments. They may move the person who's previously caused harm into that apartment, or they may get a new partner. And so I think it's really important to remember that clients have choice and control, and even when they're living in domestic violence shelters, they may still be involved in relationships. So our job as providers is to let people know what options they have, who they can reach out to discuss ongoing safety planning in their lives once they leave, but really connect with the fact that people are going to make choices about what's the right fit for them once they leave our shelter programs, and being really honest with ourselves about that. Also, one of the things that we have learned is, when you're working with a lot of clients on a particular caseload, if you're a case manager or a housing specialist, you're working with a lot of different people, and so there might be some tensions that come up with your clients because one client is a good match for a particular apartment and the other client thinks that you're not helping them and not supporting them. So we've had to help clients understand and manage their expectations and also help staff, manage a little bit if a client gets upset or frustrated with them because they feel like they're not helping them enough, because sometimes there's just apartments of a certain size available. There's apartments that are in certain areas that may or may not be safe for other clients. And so, we've learned a lot that we have to both prepare clients and staff for those kind of questions that come up.
Absolutely. And there's, we do encourage the staff to also think through, like, what family would be a good match for a particular apartment. Sometimes we do, have the opportunity to work with a broker who has multiple units that fit, most of the configuration of the families that we're serving. But we do encourage staff to talk to one another about, like, what family will be a good match for a particular apartment. We don't just, let every client know that these, 3 units are available because we want to make sure that clients don't feel like, there's favoritism or that we want to link a particular family to a unit. And so we are very careful about, who we match. And also we have conversations with the landlord or the broker about, the unit, how many people perhaps are interested in this unit, just so that we can have those difficult conversations with the landlord or the broker so that the clients don't have to do that. So I think it's, really important for the staff to engage the brokers and the landlords and ask those uncomfortable questions that may come up so that the client doesn't have to do that when they meet with the landlord or the broker face-to-face. And just preparing, the client for the fact that it's a very competitive market. You have many, many people vying for the same apartment. You're, also maybe competing with other, agencies in the area that need to house their clients as well. And of course, people willing to pay market rate for that particular apartment. And then I think talking to clients, and Rachel touched on this before, about resiliency and maintaining hope, because it can be a very long process. It can be a very frustrating process. Many times our clients lose hope, and then, perhaps they're not looking, or they're not calling, or they're not interested anymore in engaging us around, housing searches. And so I think that, being a cheerleader for the client and really trying to maintain that resiliency and that hope, I think goes a long way as well.
So
Great.
Time for a short question and answer. Thank you, everybody, so much. Sorry to jump in there, Peg. Go ahead.
That's good. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we don't have a ton of time right now, so we want to get into just a couple of the questions, and I want to remind everybody that we do have that deep dive coming up next month. So if your question doesn't get answered, that's a great time to go through some of our examples and go through a little bit more discussion on this. The first question that I wanted to ask was a question for Safe Horizon, and just if you know the average length of stay for clients who stay in shelter.
Sure. So for our emergency sites, and so these are clients that are, coming right out of the crisis, it's 90 days. And then with an additional extensions that can go up to 180 days. And so that's for our emergency sites. For our transitional shelters, clients can be with us for up to a year, but they can stay with us a little bit longer depending on, the challenges and the barriers to obtaining housing, and also, how clients are engaging in the services that we're providing.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question that we got was, it is important to consider the layers included for transgender people who have not changed their ID and other documents legally, and strategically planning how to discuss that. Do you have any feedback or advice on how you've handled those situations? And I think that question is for any of our presenters.
Yeah, hi, this is Peg. So I would just suggest that there are oftentimes survivors that we have worked with at Dash who would not necessarily would not easily access mainstream rental housing. And that is housing with larger property management companies or larger properties because of the kinds of barriers that we've touched on. And that would also get to things like if survivors IDs haven't been changed yet, or if they have credit problems, or if they have poor rental histories. And that's where I think it's really essential to have a cadre of landlords that are small, what we think of as mom and pop landlords who have maybe 1 or 2 unit or maybe up to 4 unit properties, who are more comfortable taking referrals and working with you to ensure that survivors that you're referring to them are going to have access to housing, but who have more flexibility and the ability to work around some of the stricter kinds of requirements that larger property management companies have.
And this next question kind of piggybacks on that first one, which is how can you talk about undocumented clients and getting them housing?
So I will touch upon that a little bit, and then other folks may want to jump in. So one thing to understand is whether or not the housing programs or subsidies in your area are available to families, particularly families who have mixed status. So there might be some members of the family who are U.S. citizens and some members who are not. And so for our families in New York, there are some options for mixed status households, but what that may mean is that the housing subsidy amount is less. And so we're looking at trying to help a client maybe with 2 or 3 children get into an apartment that the rent is based on a family of 2 people rather than 4 people. So sometimes we have to spend time looking longer to find the apartment that would fit that family size, and also having a landlord that would accept a family of that size. I think the other thing for undocumented families is that we know that a lot of our undocumented clients are working and they are saving money and they're finding ways to provide for their families either through their own work or through help from friends and family members, and using the time while they're in shelter to save whatever money they can so that they might be able to rent a room if they're not going to be eligible for housing subsidies, especially if the entire family doesn't have U.S. immigration status. And so I think it's about using the time you have with them in shelter to maximize what they can save, and continuing to explore options.
Just to piggyback off of what Rachel was saying, many times we do have clients or families that are not eligible for any of the subsidies due to their undocumented status, but they're working, right? And so they have an income coming in and can afford an apartment. It may not be all the rooms that they require for their family size, but they can afford it. And so one of the things that we have access to is a client emergency assistance program, that if a client is able to maintain the rent, but, perhaps they don't have access to the security and the first month's rent, we do have the ability to provide that funding for the client to be able to obtain that apartment. And we do talk to clients about just going into the communities that they're familiar with, that speak their language, that's part of their culture, and, ask, go around the community, ask folks, if they see a sign, apartment for rent, go in and speak to those particular people, as part of their community. And so we do actively engage clients and strategize with them on how they can do that.
Great, and then I think this will probably be our final question of the day, which is, how do you support a survivor who moves the abuser into the unit?
This is Peg. What I would say is, and to get to Rachel's point about survivors have a right to live their lives and in the way that they want. And so if they decide to, and Rachel, you'll probably have a lot to say about this, but my thought is that if they do choose to move the abuser into their new unit, that's certainly up to them. The priority is going to be on their safety, and so doing a lot of safety planning with them just to make sure that they feel safe with that situation. But again, getting to the importance of the relationship with their landlord, making sure that the survivor informs the landlord that they're adding this new person to the lease, so that it's all above board and that they're remaining to be a good tenant and keeping the landlord informed about what's going on in their property.
And I would also add that, you know, we talk about safety planning all the time and risk management, and so some of you on the call might be in non-residential settings, some may be in residential, and when we're in you know, non-residential settings, a lot of our clients are living with people who have caused them harm, and then when they come into shelter, we sort of see that different because they're no longer living with that person. But I think safety is still really, really important, and we can talk to our clients about steps they can do in terms of their own safety if they're getting involved in new relationships or reconnecting. I think that it is really important that we are direct with our clients, that, you know, we talk a lot about Safe Pryzen, at Safe Pryzen, how our clients talk to us about their fake lives, not their real lives. And so if we can create a space in our programming where our clients can say to us, yes, I'm in this relationship, yes, I miss living with this person or being with this person, and I may want to reconnect with them, we can actually have an open conversation about safety rather than doing safety planning that doesn't actually match what a client is really doing in their life. So that can be really powerful.
And I think it's also important, to, you know, as you have in these discussions, so clients were able to survive, right, whether they were with us or not. And so, you know, kind of exploring their protective strategies, like what has kept them safe in the past, how that's going to look different when they move out, you know, what some of the things that they can do to maintain their and their children's safety. And so continuing to have those conversations and also connecting clients to outside services. So here at Safe Pryzen, we don't have an aftercare, but we do connect, well, the shelters don't, but we do connect clients to our community program. We connect clients to a variety of programs in the community so that they still have a resource, they still have a support system in place when they move out. So if you have, you know, that resource available in your state or in the community, you know, where you're working, you know, just think through like what makes sense for the client and connect them to an aftercare program so that they can continue, you know, engaging someone around, you know, protective strategies for themselves and their children. And maybe we can take in this last follow-up question for that. Danny just asked that if they're a high rapid rehousing program and it states in their rules they're not allowed to bring the abuser back into the home, do you know if that makes them out of compliance?
I don't think that HUD has stipulated that that be the case, but it's certainly something that we could talk about in more detail afterwards. Danny, if you want to get in touch with me, or, you know, we can talk about it in the deep dive next month too.
All right, well, thank you to all of our presenters today. As you can see on the slide, all of the presenter contact information is available here. And in the follow-up materials, we will send out the link to the evaluation where you'll be able to request the certificate of attendance as well as any follow-up technical assistance. So you can ask questions directly via email to any of our presenters, ask questions through that TA request link, or just register for our upcoming deep dive and we can continue this group discussion in a little bit more interactive way. With that said, thank you so much to Safe Pryzen for joining Nash on this webinar, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
And if anybody wants more information, you can go to the website for the DV Housing Consortium at safehousingpartnerships.org.
And also information about Safe Pryzen can be found at safepryzen.org, and we will also be following up on questions at the deep dive as well.